Hello friends, and welcome to the channel, where we delve into the mind of a villain. In this entry, we'll be taking a look at Rupert Pupkin from Martin Scorsese's classic film, The King of Comedy. This film, along with Taxi Driver from 1976, served as a major inspiration for Todd Phillips' Joker in 2019. But it's The King of Comedy that had a bigger share of the inspiration, with both protagonists being poor stand-up comedians with delusions of grandeur. Now, it must be said that Rupert Pupkin would hardly be considered a nefarious character, and certainly not a blatantly evil one, but the acts of trespassing, abduction, and finally extortion are criminal to say the least, especially when they are rooted in self-interest. This self-interest has its roots in Rupert's ambition to become a stand-up comedian, to be the so-called new King of Comedy. We first meet Rupert in his elaborate scheme to infiltrate Jerry Langford's car in his attempt to break into the industry. The first two scenes of the movie quickly establish Rupert's character and personality. On the outset, there isn't anything too outlandish in terms of Rupert's physical appearance. It's only when he opens his mouth that we quickly see a key trait of Rupert's, his social ineptitude. Rupert has a glaring lack of social skills, as seen by his excessive verbal diarrhea, talking nonstop and making monologues out of what should be dialogues. In his conversation with Jerry in the car, he blabbers on and on, asks his own questions and answers them, much to Jerry's irritation. Rupert is unable to interpret nonverbal cues. The fact that Jerry has long lost interest in the conversation as seen by how he breaks eye contact and looks away. In fact, we could go so far as to say he is unable to grasp explicit verbal cues as well, if they don't line up with his self-image, as we see when Jerry calls him a moron and tells him to leave his house. Within the first few minutes of the film, Rupert is established to be a character that makes us, the audience, uncomfortable. Not in a disturbing or unsettling manner, but more so from secondhand embarrassment. We feel embarrassed when Rupert does things that deviate from normative behavior, and yet he feels he has done nothing out of the ordinary. In fact, this was one main aspect that made this movie challenging to act and direct. Rupert's excessive talking comes from his view that the older he gets, the more he should have the courage to speak whatever he wants. He expresses this sentiment in the bar with Rita, hinting that in his younger years he was more quiet and reserved. Now, as a 34-year-old man living with his mother, he has much ambition and much to say that he previously didn't dare to. When he gets out of the car with Jerry, his social ineptitude is further seen when he calls him back a total of 4 times before finally leaving him to his apartment. But this section also reveals another aspect of Rupert, the fact that his jokes aren't funny. He shows Jerry his supposed pride and joy, which at the time of filming were actual household cleaning products. But the fact remains that his sense of humor is off target and is another source of vicarious embarrassment. The ineffectiveness of his jokes is a reoccurring theme, which we see with Masha and Kathy Long's feedback to him, along with the FBI agent at the end. For a man who's supposed to be a comedian, let alone the king of them, Rupert's sense of humor is hardly a thigh slapper, showing how socially unaware he is. This social unawareness is likely caused by another aspect of Rupert's character, his delusions of grandeur. There is some use of subversion in the film, with Scorsese's choice to blur the lines of reality and delusion. Rupert is often prone to imaginations of fantasy, where he is living his dream life. His ambition is so lofty that he even envisions himself with a level of fame and success that surpasses that of Jerry's. His delusions keep him obsessively motivated, causing him to relentlessly visit Jerry's office. Even when his phone number was blacklisted, his determination kept him waiting at a public telephone for 1.5 hours. Tragically, Rupert has a weak grasp on reality, as he cannot tell the difference between what actually happens and what is merely his fantasy. The pinnacle of this is seen when he acts on Jerry's invitation to visit his summer house, along with several other supposed guests, when it was all in his head. In perhaps the most embarrassing scene of the film, when he does crash into Jerry's house uninvited, he is shocked at Jerry's hostile response and the fact that there are no other guests at the house. It's a testament to how out of touch with reality he is when he calls Jerry by his name in short form and smacks him on the shoulder casually, believing that they have a real relationship. Rupert is mentally ill, and he remains much of a mystery to other characters of the film. Even Rita, his closest friend in the film, cannot understand him. After their dinner date, she invites him up to her apartment for a cup of coffee, presumably for some intimate time, believing that his earlier bragging attempt was to impress her. Rupert, however, declines her invitation, which confuses her to the point where she plainly asks him what he really wants. This confusion extends to other characters as well, namely the receptionist at Jerry's office and Kathy Long to a lesser extent. They frequently mispronounce the name Pupkin and instead address Rupert as Pipkin, Potkin, and even Pumpkin. Perhaps the botching of his name is a nod to their lack of comprehension of him, as he constantly makes a fool out of himself with his socially deviant behavior. Or it could all be just an attempt at levity on the director's part. While it's never stated explicitly, the only thing that can explain Rupert's mental illness is his troubled upbringing. The first sign of this, albeit an inclusive one, comes during his dinner date with Rita. In the moment when Rupert brandishes his autograph to her, she comments that his handwriting is completely unreadable. The study of handwriting, or the official term of graphology, would suggest that among other reasons, untidy handwriting could be a sign of underlying emotional trauma, which manifests as distortions in the strokes. Now, as mentioned, this is not conclusive, as not everyone who has messy handwriting has emotional issues. But clearly this piece of dialogue was included in the film for a reason, and when you combine it with the other hints later, they all strongly point to the possibility of Rupert's difficult childhood. The strongest hint comes from Rupert's method of comedy. In one of his imagined delusions, when Jerry is asking him for advice, Rupert explains that his style of comedy would be to look at the awful, terrible things in his life and turn it into something funny. Or in other words, comedy from tragedy. So from Rupert's stand-up comic, we can surmise several general points without pinpointing specifics. 1. He was rejected by his parents at birth. 2. His parents were financially poor and were alcoholics. 3. He suffered physical abuse from his parents. And 4th, he was the object of bullying and persecution at school, where he was told he wouldn't amount to a hill of beans. This is seen in his delusion, where he marries his longtime crush on air and enjoys the sweet vindication of his high school principal telling him that he was right and that they were wrong to doubt him. There are other troubles that one can infer from his stand-up routine, but those are too unclear to be definitive. One example would be the suggestion that his mother isn't even alive anymore, while another involves Rupert's statement in one of his delusions where he mentions to a fan that Dolores was his father's name. Take what you will out of that, but the previously mentioned 4 points above are enough to conclude that Rupert's childhood was unpleasant enough. Perhaps Rupert's delusions are a running away from the harsh realities of life, a coping mechanism used to create a protective shell from the abuse he suffered. Maybe if he did not have the relief afforded from his fantasies, he might have reached higher levels of insanity. If that were so, then young Rupert must have repeatedly resorted to delusion to the point where it has become blended with his reality, where he is now tragically unable to differentiate between the two. Given the choice between an unpleasant life and one where he is the king, one can see why Rupert would choose the latter. In a sense, it's a double-edged sword, preserving his mind but detracting him from reality. When watching Rupert repeatedly struggle to get Jerry's attention, one would wonder why wouldn't Rupert just take his advice to start at the bottom and work his way up the local comedy clubs. As Jerry advises him, you can't just walk into national television without any experience. He receives this advice a second time later from Kathy, and it seems to be the logical thing to do, to test out his jokes in front of a live audience with little stakes, as opposed to having his debut in front of millions of viewers. However, he refuses to do this, and only clings onto Jerry as his only hope. Throughout the film, we find no record of him at a comedy club or him recounting his experience at one. This is speculative, but it's likely that Rupert did indeed start out at the comedy clubs, but given the previously mentioned negative feedback from his jokes, it's probable that his routine wasn't well received. However, his delusional state prevents him from accepting criticism. If anything, the fault is on his audience and not on him. We see this when he challenges Kathy Long directly, saying he has no faith in her judgment when she gives him feedback on his jokes. With the comedy clubs being a no-go for him, he decides to use Jerry as his shortcut to the top. However, when Jerry makes it clear he wants nothing to do with him, Rupert resorts to the unthinkable, kidnapping him and using him to extort his way into the show. Despite his frequent delusions, Rupert knows exactly the consequences that await him. But in his own words, a guy can get anything he wants as long as he pays the price. The price of jail time is worth it to Rupert, as seen by his most quotable line where he says, "It's better to be king for a night than a schmuck for a lifetime." In closing, when discussing the character of Rupert Pupkin, it'd be remiss if we didn't cover the ending. There has been much debate over the last scene as to whether Rupert is still in his delusion or if he did actually become the successful comedian he was trying to be. There has been no official confirmation on which is true, and this debate is likely to continue on. But it's suggestible that the ending sequence was still a delusion for the following reasons. First, it's obvious that something is very wrong by the fact that the announcer keeps repeating his introduction of Rupert. Second, given the poor reception of his extorted routine, Rupert's newfound success with his book tours and high viewership seems very improbable and wouldn't likely happen in reality. Third, after the scene ends and the credits roll, the song "Wonderful Remark" is played. Some of the lyrics are insightful and perhaps shed some light on the ending. Specifically, there is a portion of the song where the singer sings, "I told a million lies to myself. So perhaps the song is a reference to the fact that even at the end, Rupert is still deluding himself into a fantasy. But while it still could be all in his head, there appears to be a glimmer of hope. Rupert appears stiff and reluctant, almost if he's uncomfortable and doesn't want to be there. Despite being introduced by the speaker, he remains speechless and appears to have a forced smile, a huge difference from his usual animated and jovial self. So maybe, while it could still be a delusion, it's one that has a slight dose of reality. Perhaps Rupert has come to terms with his lackluster humor, and the notion of being a comedian doesn't appeal to him as much as it did before. But on the other hand, the ending could be real too, given that Scorsese has a previous film where what appears to be a fantasy ending was confirmed by him to be real, most notably in Taxi Driver. But what do you think of Rupert Pupkin from the King of Comedy, folks? And what do you think of the film's ending? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and take care.